All right. I'm Joe Turner, and this is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and other public sector executives. It is the most influential local government podcast in America. And before we jump into this interview with Daniel Reilly, he's an attorney in the Northeast. We're going to talk about public and private sector compensation, negotiations, and how they differ. I would like to remind you all to please like and support the podcast. Please leave a rating and review on Apple and Spotify. I am this close to getting to 200 ratings and reviews on Apple. I've been doing this for less than a year. I'm really proud of that. If you could help me get to that 200 mark, I would greatly appreciate it. So if you really enjoy this podcast I put out for you on each week, I would appreciate it if you took a moment to put a rating and review out there, especially those Apple users. With me today is Daniel Reilly. He is an attorney in the Northeast. We've had I've been trying to get Dan on the podcast now for many, many, many months. We've been talking about it and just haven't been able to get our schedules lined up, but here we are. And I think we're going to have a really exciting episode. We're going to talk about private sector, public sector compensation models and how I think we can bring some of the private sector principles and practices into the public sector. And so, Dan, before we jump into it, why don't you give us a brief little introduction about your background, and then we'll kind of go into your experience in this neck of the woods.
Sure, Jeff. Thanks for having me on, first of all. I'm glad we're able to finally schedule this. As you said, it's been a while trying to coordinate our schedules here. My name is Dan Reilly. I am an attorney in Rhode Island. I'm also licensed in Massachusetts, and I have of-counsel relationships in multiple other states, so I handle client matters throughout the country. My practice is a combination of a focus on executive compensation and employment, as well as outside counsel to businesses, and I do corporate employment, mergers and acquisitions, and related work for my clients. In years past, I also worked as an executive recruiter for a headhunting firm for a few years, while also working as an attorney, which gave me really the opening into my executive compensation practice. I left there to focus solely on representing, I say executives, but that really is employees at all different levels. Depending on the company, they may or may not have the need to engage with an attorney as we're negotiating offers and employment contracts, severance packages, stock option plans, things like that. So I really started that practice out of being a headhunter, and I've seen both sides and negotiated offers from the standpoint of management, from the standpoint of employees, and now I'm really focused solely on the employee side when it comes to executive compensation and employment work. And on the government side, I also served as a state legislator for 4 years back in a previous life. So I have, I would say, an interesting exposure to state and local government, more so than perhaps other attorneys, certainly people who are working in this line of work.
Is it fair to say that you have experience negotiating contracts for both public and private sector executives?
That's right. From offers to contracts to just providing counsel on contracts that have already been put into effect, providing advice to town councils in some cases on contracts that they have in effect and how to better align them with their management teams. So I've worked on the public side. I would say my experience is greater on the private side just because,
Sure.
and this is what I think we're going to talk about a lot today, about the services that people like me provide are much more prevalent in the private sector. I have a background in working with private equity firms. There's quite a bit of executive turnover in a good way in those businesses. They're constantly rotating executive teams out. And so the model is much more refined. The public sector is pretty far behind the eight ball on that. And so that work is a smaller part of my practice. I'm hoping to grow it really for the public sector executives themselves, because I can see, both as a practicing attorney, handling employment work, as well as for some clients, handling affairs at the municipal level and working with town and city councils, I can tell that the incentives really aren't aligned and the system could be greatly improved.
Yeah, I've had many conversations with individuals over the last year and a half since I've been working on my LinkedIn platform and the podcast. And I've actually had many managers approach me and say, will you take a look at my contract, or can you help me review it? Or, hey, you should, consider starting a consulting business and helping managers get better contracts and things of that sort of nature. And while I'm intrigued by that, I've started AAME, right? The American Association of Municipal Executives now. That's sort of like the bigger umbrella. That's the big picture to me that I'm more passionate about, as opposed to just specifically compensation. Although everyone knows I talk about compensation quite a bit, I think that's just one part of the equation. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is that I've had one specific manager recently reach out to me. He has a legal background, and he's been kicking around the idea of starting his own consulting as far as helping managers during the contract negotiation. Because as you will attest, just a minute ago, you said what public sector is way behind. most city managers negotiate their contracts themselves. They don't actually have an expert, a lawyer, or an agent, if you will, who will go in and negotiate their contracts for them. And I would proffer to you that I think most city managers are horrible negotiators when it comes to their contracts. What are your thoughts on that in general?
Well, I don't think that is something reserved to just city managers. I think a lot of people are not great, even if they're great negotiators in their line of work and great at what they do. It's awkward negotiating your own contract. That's the same for everyone. We can talk about it in greater detail, but one of the things that comes up with my clients quite often when I'm negotiating an employment contract, a very awkward point is severance. They're being hired, but I'm trying to work in severance into their contract so that this is not a question mark if and when things go south, hopefully just if things go south and they have to leave. That's a very awkward conversation to have. If you're someone starting a job or trying to get this contract signed, you don't want to be talking about how it would end. But
Right.
lawyers are very good at being the skunks at the garden party and focusing on the negative aspects of things. But this is one of those things where it's good that we're focusing on the negative aspects of things. The ounce of prevention is worth the pound of cure. And so that is something that even the most experienced, capable town or city administrator, manager, police chief, fire chief, they're not going to be thinking of those things when they're having those conversations.
It's interesting because when we talk about in the context of say an agent per se, we know about multi-million dollar head coaches and athletes who sign these deals, and the agent will get a percentage of it, right? I don't know exactly what the going rate is. Maybe it's 3%, 10%. I don't know exactly how it works with those size of numbers. And then you work, like I said, heavily in the private sector, and I don't know if that's how you're normally commissioned on that. If that's a flat rate structure on your hours, or if it's a percentage. But if and I wouldn't mind for you to unpack that if you don't mind. But you go into the public sector where obviously the executives, I mean, they make decent money, but it ain't like they're making a $500,000 contract, generally speaking, right? So there's not really a lot of meat on the bone for a manager to pay for this sort of expertise or advice. I mean, where do you see that going, and how that might evolve with respect to getting professional representation for managers during negotiations, if that makes sense?
Well, this is a very interesting conversation because when you say agent, that's how I like to characterize my role for executives and public or private sector. And that is a concept that really hasn't translated from the sports and entertainment world to the private sector, even though, especially in the private sector, the compensation numbers can be comparable to those types of people, athletes, entertainers who are making all of this money. In the private sector, compensation typically involves, at a certain level, you have compensation consultants that get retained by boards that come up with the structure and the benchmarks and the numbers that would be competitive for someone in a field doing what they do. The lawyers paper the file. We see all of the contracts for all of our clients. Over time, that adds up to an edge for our clients because we know what should be in there, what works, what doesn't, and also what is considered, call it your model agreement. That can include compensation figures. When you think of a traditional agent, they really combine those two roles. The best agents out there are armed with binders of data points, maybe from their clients, maybe open sourced info, maybe stuff that they have teams of people that just they collect this information. They take that, they act as the negotiator. They will redline and put together the contract. Yes, you have sports and entertainment lawyers who actually sign off, but we know the agents are doing most of this. They're licensed, they get a commission. Like you said, it's typically based on their cash compensation or other compensation. And so everyone is aligned. The interests are aligned. The agents are constantly focused on getting the best deal for their client. And that's where I try to focus my practice, combining those two areas of practice and providing those services to my clients. For some clients, they are open to the traditional called agent cash compensation, small percentage, 1 to 3% of cash compensation as my compensation, and I just stay retained with them. That is something that is slowly being adapted in the private sector, and I think very rare, if not never found in the public sector right now.
Right.
Typically, how will be compensated, this because this is an important point for higher level executives. Payment for legal and accounting fees is covered as a part of top tier employment agreements, either in
You
an
mean you mean
annual
covered by the employer?
by the employer. That's right. By
Okay.
a at either initially for purposes of negotiating that contract, perhaps on an ongoing basis. It really depends. You're going to see these in CEO level contracts, publicly traded companies in the C suite. You're going to see this private equity firms. Certainly, you can imagine This is a type of benefit that will probably be more likely found in a higher compensated employee's contract. But that is the type of benefit that should be employed by public sector
Yeah.
employees, by public sector management teams and managers, because that is not a crazy thing to do. A few $1,000s, whatever it is, depending on their contract, the amount of compensation, the state they're located in, the work required to cover lawyers and accountants, is an important benefit for your executives and an important piece in the puzzle in incentivizing them to take the deal. That is not an insignificant benefit to offer them. So I just bring that up, but not necessarily tied to the agent part of the conversation, but related to how people who provide these services are compensated. There is that adaptation the public sector needs to make there as well.
Yeah, man, you hit on a lot of points, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show and talk about this, Dan, is because for a long time I've been preaching about the importance of bringing more of this private sector mentality into public sector executive contracts and negotiations. And getting back to the prologue, I guess, of my earlier comment about people inviting me or asking me to maybe be engaged in their negotiations, and this other manager expressing a desire to be a part, like a third party negotiator, is I've just never really understood quite how do we skin this cat to make it economically feasible for me or somebody else to do it. It's interesting because, like you just said a second ago, in the private sector, it's not uncommon for the employer to pay these expenses on behalf of the employee that they're recruiting into the position. And you talk about that being an important benefit, that it could be transferred to this candidate. I mean, it sounds like what you're telling me is we could maybe take that approach into the public sector, and maybe at the executive level we need to start asking for these governing bodies to include in our contract language the ability for them to cover some of these aspects. Is that what you're basically kind of saying?
Certainly, I think that's a part of a competitive contract. I think it is, it's pennies compared to the amount of compensation or the numbers in compensation that would have to change to really recruit high quality, really rock star talent. But it's just one other piece when you were to look at what does the private sector do to hire these types of people versus what does the public sector do. This is something the private sector does, and it's not universal. I mean, that
Yeah.
is something I try to negotiate on behalf when it's not in a contract for my client. Hopefully, my services are pretty limited at the front end of the contract, but depending on how it's structured and what the compensation looks like, they're probably going to be giving their accountant quite a bit of business. So I lump those two things in together. And in the public sector, just like in the private sector, you have a fair amount of employees being recruited across state lines. They're being relocated. They're going into different markets. That brings with it all sorts of tax complications and related matters that really have to be addressed by professionals. If you don't put it in the contract, that is something they're going to have to pay for themselves. A lot of times they do, but for the more competitive people, that is going to be something they're increasingly going to be able to ask for.
So before I want to go down that road a little bit more, but not right this second, Dan. So if I lose my train of thought later on this podcast, can you please try to circle back to this element? Because what I want to talk to you about in more detail is how do we go about in the public sector, maybe introducing these concepts more into the public sector, and what strategies, I have some thoughts on it, but I'd also like to pick your brain and get your thoughts with your legal mind. How do we maybe bring some of these concepts into the public sector? But before we get in that conversation, I wanted to circle back to something you said earlier and kind of like get back to why I also started AAME, the American Association of Municipal Executives. I've just been incredibly frustrated in so many respects when it comes to the lack of advocacy and education on behalf of managers with respect to compensation. And we've seen compensation change so dramatically in the public sector. I can't speak for your private sector clients, but in the public sector, it's changed so dramatically since the pandemic because we've had so many people, just obviously the boomers that are retiring out, and it's almost been exacerbated a little bit by the pandemic. And so you have a supply demand imbalance. You have city managers who are getting hired with much lower levels of experience, but yet governing bodies have to pay more. The job's becoming more risky, more volatile, all this turnover, so forth and so on. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to do American Association of Municipal Executives, because I wanted to blend sort of all this advocacy slash union slash agent representation from a legal aspect as contract, all this stuff, and bring it under this one big umbrella. And I'll be the first one to tell you, and I've told everyone else who listens to the podcast and in my post, this is a work in progress, right? Where this organization's in its infancy. It's going to have a lot of different iterations. I'm not exactly sure how this is all going to shape out, but I think this conversation is a very valuable one as us as a profession, start really drilling down into the compensation issues, because one of the things I find really frustrating about the volatility of this profession is, well, one of the reasons why it's so volatile is because a lot of governing bodies don't have to pay a true price when it comes to hiring and firing a city manager, right? It's not coming out of their pocket, first of all. And a lot of times it's just a 6 month severance, or sometimes no severance or less. I mean, obviously there's 1 year severances out there and so forth and so on. But, when you don't really value something, or when something is so cheap, right? Or you don't value yourself, you don't get treated well. Right. And I think one of the reasons that we as executives can start getting treated better is if we start actually having a mindset approach of treating ourselves like executives and what we should expect, and expect more. And I was wondering, maybe you might want to unpack that a little bit more in a broader context, because obviously you're an attorney and what have you. But to me, I think one of the ways you start lowering the volatility is by putting a higher premium and value on the services that we provide, and so that you can kind of minimize turnover, because turnover becomes really costly and really expensive, not only to the organization in raw direct dollar terms, but indirectly to the impact of the organization and the disruption and the upheaval.
Well, I think in the context of the association, that can be used to address all of the issues you just talked about, as well as the point you put a pin in, which was how do we bring the private sector ideas into the public sector? I think they're all related, and here's why. We're talking about compensation. That's what makes the headlines. Where this process really starts, if we're going to make the public sector more like the private sector, is in the recruiting process and how we look for executives. So when you talk about the association, where you have an opportunity here, and a really big one, is to set the standards for how professionals are to be recruited as if they were private sector professionals. Use of scorecards, benchmarking, good job descriptions. When a candidate is in a short list of a process and they're doing multiple rounds of interviews, how are those interviews being done? How are the reference checks and real top grading type reference checks being done at their prior employers? Beyond, in this nature, in this line of work, there's obviously a lot of public records, but really diving into how they are as managers, treating them as professionals. So you're putting forward the best possible candidates before a public body looking to hire them, but they know exactly what it is they need to be hired for. They have a scorecard in place with the job description before they've ever taken the job, that you can assess their past performance against to see if they're really the top best candidate for that position. And you're hiring them in, and now you have a scorecard to measure their performance against. You also have your scorecard and your job description to incorporate into the contract, to apply or create a compensation plan around, so all of the incentives are aligned, and to really create these best practices for compensation and the other attributes of these professional jobs and how they're put together. And I think an association or some other body that is out there creating these best standards and pushing them out there and creating a best process that can be implemented by municipalities and other governmental bodies is the ideal way to do this, because one executive is not going to be able to push the rock up the hill themselves. But if they can point to model documents, model contracts, model processes at a nationally recognized organization that may have affiliated attorneys and accountants and consultants attached to it, they may have access to this by virtue of their membership, whatever that is, they can point to that. And it's not just them saying, it's not just their lawyers saying it, it's
Right.
this body of evidence saying, no, these are the collected best practices that should be implemented at the municipal level. And for many communities, they're not in a position to really refute that. They aren't, they may engage
They don't know.
consultants.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They're not. Yeah.
They may rely on their headhunter, which I think is how it really works in most municipalities, to compile this information. Where you want to be is, as an executive, you want to say, you should be asking when you're looking to get hired or you're interviewing for a job, what it is you want me to do. I want to see if this is right for me. I have to see if the expectations are correct. But you're not really in a position to be making those decisions or coming up with that info. They have to provide that to you. When a town is looking to hire an administrator, they need to be going to them and saying, listen, the job entails all of this, your 3 paragraphs or 3 pages or whatever of information. But really, first year success looks like this, and it's 5 points. And your second year success looks like this, and it's another 5 points. This is what we need done. We need the sewer line replaced. Relations with the school district are horrible. We need them totally rebuilt. our IT infrastructure is shot and needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. Those are three very different things that require three very different skill sets. As the entity hiring someone,
Right.
I'm going to be looking for someone with those specific experiences or something analogous to that, so I know they're capable of it. From the executive, you're going to point of view, you're going to be taking that information, assessing your own performance, saying, I can do that, and here's why. Here are the three people you should call, and I will set up those calls for you to tell you I'm good at X, Y, and Z. And all of that gets wrapped up into now you're a top notch candidate, you've sold yourself, the hiring entity is confident about hiring you, you are in the driver's seat for that compensation conversation. And ideally, you can then craft a contract with your advisors that not only reflects what you're truly worth. If you're a real A player, you're going to walk into your contract negotiation and say, my compensation should be tied to the completion of those scorecard elements. Oh, and by the way, it should be double what you've budgeted to pay, but here's why it's going to be worth it for you because I'm going to
Right.
do
Right.
X, Y, and Z. You need to have that confidence coming in, but that confidence is backed by the data. The confidence is backed by the paperwork and the process and what you've had to complete and what the hiring entity is looking for. And it really provides a complete picture for candidates. And that's what attracts top talent. That's what top talent reacts to. That's quite frankly what gives hiring authorities the political cover to make their decisions because they're going through a process like they were running a private company and they were using their own money. And they can go back to their constituents and the taxpayers and say, we're doing it this way. We may be paying them more. Everyone's going to notice the number. That's all everyone cares about. But here's what's going to happen. They don't get half their compensation if that sewer line isn't replaced in a year. They don't get half their compensation if relations with the school district don't improve or something like that. That's something that's tangible that they can take back to their constituents, and you need to provide that sort of thing for them as well.
Yeah, there's obviously needs to be a complete reimagination or revamping of how a public sector executive compensation works, in my opinion. Because right now, I've talked about this before, is that current compensation models disincentivize risk taking and do not reward those who are exceptional at their job. Right? Because if you are really good and you crush it out of the park, the difference between you and a mediocre manager is that you both get a cola and you might get a couple extra 100 basis points on a raise. It doesn't really justify all the true A performers, right? The A level performers, the elite talent, don't get rewarded like they should based off the value they create. And you talked about having this confidence of going into negotiations. That's one of the things that I've been trying to promote through the LinkedIn and through the podcasting when I talk about the environment, how it's changed. When I start talking about how all these new managers are getting hired in at numbers that are significantly higher than their predecessor, when I talk about the supply imbalance and so forth and so on. And I've been wanting to blend that into a fully comprehensive picture, kind of like you just laid out, where you have an organization like the AAME who is going out and educating not only executives but governing body officials, elected officials about the current marketplace when it comes to compensation, when it comes to benefits and so forth and so on. But there's something really sexy, and this might be a weird word to use in a podcast, but there's something really sexy, Dan, when I'm having a conversation with somebody on the podcast, and I feel like that we've arrived at the same place or the same thought process, even though we've never talked about it. And you
Hmm.
just hit on something that's very important to me. And you talked about sort of this whole issue with public sector recruiting versus private sector recruiting. And I don't know we really want to go down that road today completely, but I would like to flesh it out in more detail at some point, because I don't want to stray too far from the actual negotiation and contract issues of the public sector versus the private sector. But I have talked about in multiple posts, and I don't know if I've actually talked about on the podcast. I actually have talked about in the podcast about who holds recruiters accountable, especially in the context of Baker Tilly, who you may or may not know I've been beating up on as a recruiter in the public sector space. But I talk about how oftentimes city manager candidates feel like they are not treated with respect. They're not treated as professionals. They're not treated as a prize by the recruiters when they're going out and trying to apply for these positions. And that really frustrates me, because I think even though that they're being paid by the local government, and that's their actual first level customer, we are a secondary customer, and that we are the product, and we should be treated with respect. And I don't think that's happening. And I've talked about the need of creating almost like a candidate bill of rights, right? Or like a recruit. Someone referred to maybe a recruiter code of ethics or code of honor or something like that. And this idea to me is like, and this is why I want to push AAME to do as we get forward and start getting our legs under us, is start setting forth these requirements and expectations of the recruiters and of the recruitment process for these managers. When it comes about, pay transparency as an example, right? Certain types of communication benchmarks or requirements, so forth and so on. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more before I don't want to go fully down that train of public sector versus private sector recruiting for the sake of this podcast, but can you give me maybe a couple of things that really stand out to you as you understand the different processes and something that maybe I should be thinking about in more detail as I launch AAME in earnest?
Well, I think the recruiting process and negotiating a contract are really, I mean, they flow. They're not one and the same, but they flow right into each other.
Right.
If you have a better recruiting process, you're going to have a better process to negotiate compensation.
Agreed.
Negotiating the contract doesn't come out of thin air. It's going to come out of a job description. You're going to be found somehow. It all really is one process that needs to be overhauled, and you can't fix one without fixing the other. In terms of making really overhauling how the public sector recruits people, a few things you have to consider, and really have to, if you were to start with first principles here, from my standpoint at least, and some recruiters may not share this, or some other lawyers may not share it, but from my standpoint is the best candidates are never those, never say never, but rarely those who respond to job applications. In the private sector, when you're looking for someone who meets and again, if you've done the process right, you've created a pretty narrow a narrow description, set of attributes that you want someone to fulfill, you should be able to go out and generate a long list of people who match that criteria based on their work history, their performance. In this case, their public records, which it's a lot easier to find that in the public sector, right, than the private sector, to really see who is a rock star out there. And then you reach out to those people and you try to get a short list out of that. And that's where recruiting is a sales job, because you're trying to reach out to someone who's totally comfortable in their job, and you want them to be. Because if they're racing out, that's a red flag. Sometimes you have edge cases, right? If their company's being sold,
Sure.
they've done everything right.
And
then
again,
they're
for
going to
the
be gone.
audience listening, we're talking in generalities. Okay. So, I mean,
Right.
yeah, it's like, yeah. So
Yeah. Ideally, your top person isn't being chased out somewhere.
the
They're
classic passive candidate, right? The classic passive,
exactly.
right, right.
Exactly. That's not something that you're not going to attract those people by posting public job descriptions and trying to just build a funnel, and you're going to fill it. But are you filling it with that best type of candidate? And so if you're doing that and you're going out to reach out to the best people, those people are going to be in a position to negotiate their best deal. They have the
They have the
advantageous
leverage.
position, right? Because
Yeah.
they're totally fine where
Yeah.
they
You
are.
came to me, right? You came to
Right.
me.
But you really want to be talking to people who are comfortable, generally speaking, again, where they are. And that may be comfort. I mean, they may have, in the private sector, they're in the process of selling the company. They're ready for their next role. They know it's going to be in 6 months. They're taking this phone call with you as the recruiter because they know, hey, I want to figure out what my next play is. I'm going to be leaving here because I did everything right. Everyone's happy, but I'm going to be gone. That happens too. But they don't advertise those things. You still have to pick up the phone and find those people. So the public sector recruiting process has to get more like that. And recruiters have to be more proactive about
But
finding those
can I
good
stop?
people.
Can I
Yeah.
stop you there though? Because what I find frustrating, and I don't, this is something that I'll just say it because I don't mind being out there, being unfiltered and edgy. I don't have the data to prove this, okay? I don't have the data, but I can tell you anecdotally, the sentiment is that I have and many, many other managers has is that most recruiters in the public sector space, they go out, they get their 25, 30, $40,000 contract from the municipality to go find a city manager. They put up a couple of job wanted ads on the main message boards, and then they basically serve as resume collectors, and then they basically process that, and that's what they're doing for the money. And I don't, again, I'm not saying every recruiter does that. I know there's some recruiters who are proactive, but I know that that's the main difference between, at least I believe that's the main difference between the public and private
Yeah.
sector, because there's the private sector is much more. I oh man, I have to be careful sometimes because I do have a healthy sort of skepticism and frustration with local government, right? And typical sort of bureaucrat ease. But there's no question in my mind that private sector recruiters are grinding and hustling far more than public sector recruiters when it comes to finding and locating talent in exchange for the compensation that they're receiving. I believe that.
Recruiters in the private and public sector, I think, generally speaking, and this is not a knock and then I'll explain why, do that generally. They generally are resume magnets. They provide it for a fee. That they provide other services certainly, and that's what they do. And that's fine for a lot of different roles. Let's be clear. When you're hiring for multiple roles at the same level, same job description, things like that, depending on the level of skill and training, compensation level, there are going to be many reasons why that's the better process to use. But what we're talking about specifically is when you're recruiting executive talent, when you're trying to find people who are coming in and you're gonna negotiate a contract one-on-one with them. They're coming in to run a department, they're coming in to run an agency, a whole town, a county, whatever it is, a district. And that is hiring an executive. That is a like the private sector would be hiring a VP or above, call it, or someone in the C-suite, or the president and CEO, to a lesser extent board members, but because they have different criteria generally. But so that is the process that should be used to hire those people in the private sector. For the absolute top performers, that is how they're getting recruited. That is why the top search firms get paid what they do, and they're pulling 33% of the starting salary of someone making $1 million. Their fees are huge, but they're going out and convincing that rock star person who's doing a great job somewhere else making a ton of money to then go take your opportunity.
Right.
They're earning their fee. That has to happen in the public sector. And those people are not going to be the ones you can't bank on them responding to a job ad.
Right. And that's kind of a selfish, shameless plug. One of the reasons why I started doing the job board on my weekly newsletter and selling it to recruiters and trying to get people to put their job postings in my newsletter is because this is reaching a passive audience, right? I got people on the LinkedIn network who are already there. They're reading my newsletter for other news, and they can say, "Oh, there's some jobs listed here that they were not actually going out to look at a job board for," right? Like you said, most passive candidates are not actively looking on job boards because they're happy. I will say this. I do think that there needs to be I don't know if I don't want to be absolute and say a complete overhaul of the public sector recruitment model, but I do think it needs to have some significant changes. That kind of goes hand in hand with this whole conversation because I'm not sure exactly how we sort of reimagine and reshape this whole process when it comes to the cost structure for recruitment and so forth and so on. Because obviously, public sector recruitment is generally speaking a flat fee model. There are some cities here and there who will hire a one-off private sector recruiter or primarily a private sector recruiter, and they will pay a percentage of that compensation. But you got most recruiters out there that are charged. It's kind of gotten up to that 30 range, that $30,000 for a recruitment range. Well, if you're hiring someone in at $200,000 to be your city manager, not a lot of cities are comfortable, at least right now in the current environment, of paying something like 60 some $1,000s for that recruitment. You know what I mean? So I'm not sure how we get from point A to point B, but I do think there needs to be some movement in that direction.
I hate to sound like the lawyer here and shove it off on someone else, but really, I agree with you. There's a numbers problem there, and without the compensation really being, even if the compensation did go up dramatically for executives, there still is going to be the cost of a consultant that will be difficult to swallow for a lot of governmental bodies, and for not all bad reasons. Let's remember, but I think that where the real reform will start is at the municipal level, where they will implement the best practices. I don't know how that will work out for the recruiters long term, but a good company has a job description ready for when they retain a recruiter. They have a scorecard ready. Recruiters will, search firms in particular will get paid to help refine that. They'll look at the market, they'll look at their past experience and perhaps offer suggestions. But really, the best companies that are just ready to start strong out of the gate with a good quality candidate, they're going to have their idea set in stone and they're going to have it written down. Every municipality, every public body should be the same way. When you're recruiting someone, and it could be a police officer, it could be a teacher, certainly at the executive level, they should have all of that information lined up. And that allows their recruiter, hopefully, to start off maybe on second base in the recruiting process. Yeah, I still think they're gonna have to overhaul their business. I'm not sure how their fees align, but I think the municipality can get in the driver's seat on a lot of those changes and start to attract better candidates as a result.
So what I'm kind of, I don't know if you're telling me this or not, but what I'm kind of hearing from you, Dan, is that I think city managers probably need to be much more aggressive in writing their own job description once they get into that position, right? And I also think what you're saying is that elected officials and HR directors need to be better at drafting. So we live in the public sector where things are slow to change. And generally speaking, the job description is the same job description that's been there for the last 5, 10, 15 years, right? It just, it's like a just cut and paste every time there's a new vacancy, right?
Mhm.
But what we all know though is that organizations are like living organisms, and they grow and they change, and they need an individual with a certain strength at this time, and when the next time the vacancy opens they might need somebody with a specialized skill over here. And so what it sounds like you're saying is that these local governments need to be much more aggressive in writing job descriptions that are more geared toward the current environment or condition of the organization, as opposed to this plug and play, just copy and paste model that we've seen for eons.
Absolutely. And you hinted at the managers themselves writing their own job descriptions. And let me address that, not through the prism of being a city manager and what I would do, because I'm not one, I'm a lawyer. So what I would do as their lawyer, if someone retained me or is just talking to me and they're early on in a process, talking to a municipality or another public body, it would be the same as if someone is in early stage talks with a private company. Before we get to the offer, I always try to help negotiate the offer letter. It's like negotiating the letter of intent before a company or real estate sale. We get all the key terms out of the way, makes the contract drafting a lot more efficient, hopefully faster and easier too. And before we get to the offer stage, there's a lot of research and conversation that has to be done. Same for private or public sector, but let's focus on the public sector here. My client, I'm going to talk to them about who's recruiting you, why are they recruiting you, who is there now. Talk to me about the agency. Here are all the questions we should be sending to them. Forget about they put in, let's use the job description they have, but let's assume that there's probably more to this job. And if you were to write your own job description, we had to figure out what we would put in that based on our assessment, the candidate's assessment of the agency or the organization. So you're going to do all your public sector research. You're going to look at the past history. You're going to look in this line of work. You're going to look in the public domain for everything you can find. You're going to look up budgets. You're going to look up financial statements. You're going to see the true condition. This is what it looks like walking in on day one would look like. And from there, my client and I are going to work out, okay, this is what we think the job description should be. This is what we think that, the scorecard element should be. None of that's required as part of the hiring process, but that allows us to go into negotiations armed with more questions than answers, which in any negotiation is ideal, at least from my standpoint. I try to ask more questions of the other party. It elicits more information. If I do it right, it also tells them where my head is at without putting declaratory statements on the record. So that's always helpful. And in this case, you're not trying to trick anyone. You genuinely want to have your questions answered. The best candidates' performance in those types of situations will be assessed based on the types of questions they ask, the level of detail they're getting into, and the information they're requesting, and so forth. So all of that's being collected and used to really determine what type of situation is the candidate, is my client walking into. That should set the stage for the compensation. That should set the stage for everything else. Is this something my client should even be interested in? Is this something we should get to the offer letter stage, or should we abandon if it is clear that we're just not aligned and where this is going and compensation and so forth? So that's how I would take that process in the context of, from the perspective of the manager, of the employee to be. Certainly, if the municipality, if the agency or organization undertook that level of detail when putting together a job description and scorecard, they would be starting so much further ahead. But
Right.
from my standpoint, not representing the municipalities, I have to play off, what's going to be on the other side of the table, and in all likelihood, we will probably be having to take those steps right now, unless and until municipalities can start to implement best practices around recruiting and retaining people.
Man, I'm so damn stoked right now about this podcast. I don't want to stroke myself, but I am like no other podcast out there brings this kind of content, this kind of discussion to city managers and public sector executives, and that's why I'm very proud of the work I've been doing. And I'd hate to be sounding very arrogant about it, but this is the value that I want to bring to city managers and public sector executives, also in the context of AAME, the American Association of Municipal Executives. I just completely want to rewrite and reimagine the whole entire process of how this profession's been operating when it comes to advocacy and education on behalf of the managers. Let's kind of transition a little bit more into the brass tacks of contracts and compensation and negotiation when it comes to private sector versus public sector. I've said it time and time again. I'll say it here. I've argued that the most important aspect of contract negotiation, the most important objective for city managers is to minimize risk. And the number one way, not the only way, but the number one way to minimize risk when you're a city manager is on that severance clause. I figure that's probably the best way to start the conversation here, and we can maybe get into the tributaries of other items. Why don't you unpack that for me, your thought process as far as the private sector versus the public sector? And
Sure. The private sector, severance in the private sector for executive level contracts. Again, as we talked about at the very beginning of our conversation here, I try to broach the subject very early on. I try to incorporate it into an employment agreement. It really should be, so there's no question as to what happens when the employment relationship ends. And what you're really talking about is a few different types of termination, essentially three: termination with cause, termination without cause, and resignation for good reason. In the context of the private sector, let's get it out of the way what the big difference is between that and the public sector. Change of control, company gets sold. That creates all sorts of issues with executives. A good contract will incorporate automatic, accelerated vesting of stock and things like that for executives whose company is sold. That's generally considered a good thing, a merger or sale of some sort, especially if that's what they were hired to do. You want them to not be stuck at the new company. You want them to reap the benefits of their work. That's obviously something you're not going to see in the private sector. So change of
except we have a parallel, which would be change of control with the form of an election. Or
Absolutely right.
okay, yep.
That is your right. So you're not going to accelerate your stock options if you have a change of control. What you need to be focused on is downside protection in the event of change of control, and that would really be, what does a termination without cause look like in the event of a change of control, or also in any context, even if you don't have a change of control. Let's put a pin in that for a quick second, because you also have, of course, for cause termination, which is, in all of the contracts I've reviewed and drafted, negotiated, it's almost always the same language that's used: committing a felony, doing something that puts the company in a really bad light. The bottom line is you can come up with pretty concrete criteria for what would constitute a for cause termination. I know the public sector has a difficult time with this, but it's pretty well adapted in the public sector.
The
And
key word
yeah,
there is concrete. The key word is
yeah,
concrete because there's far too many city manager contracts out there where the termination for cause language is too subjective
yep,
and too open to interpretation.
yep.
I know there's some out there who suggest that it should be as restrictive as only in terms of being convicted of a felony, which
Mhm.
obviously is a very restrictive language or whatnot. But give us some examples of where you think that we could really be improving in that area when it comes to private sector versus the public sector and the concrete language. Because I'll give you an example of something that I don't like: vague language about violating your personnel policy manual, which, I mean,
Mhm.
we're talking about 100-page, multiple hundreds of pages of documents. That's, I think, way too subjective. You have things like moral turpitude and so forth and so on. And, there is an element too, again, getting back to the severance package in of itself of like, hey, elected officials have the right to hire and fire at their will, right, at their whim, so to speak. And I think in the private sector it's much easier to, I guess, get rid of somebody because both sides are being sort of oftentimes, maybe I'm wrong and you can speak to this, Dan, but I've always had the sort of impression that in the private sector, when someone's being fired for cause or what have you, or even without cause, it's a little bit of a less messy situation because there's more flexibility in how those individuals get compensated for that separation. When the public sector, when someone's like leaving for the 3 months severance package, for example, that doesn't even cover oftentimes the cost, the 6% to sell your house nowadays. You know
Right,
what I
right.
mean? So it's like the financial toll of separation on the part of the city manager is much more significant than it is in the private sector, in my opinion. And that's why I think there has to be a complete sort of remapping and reshaping of the language when it comes to the concreteness of the
Yeah.
termination for cause.
So these, I don't want to give anyone the misimpression that it's straightforward in the private sector and these things don't get litigated. These things get
Sure.
litigated all the time, right? There are a lot of motivations on both sides in the event of for cause terminations and the fact patterns that give rise to those situations. There are a lot of motivations on both sides to come up with a relatively amicable arrangement, especially in those, call it edge cases, where it may be open to subjective interpretation, but
Right.
it's clear the company has an interest in getting rid of the executive. And
But here's the thing,
yeah,
Dan. Here's the and sorry to interrupt you here, but here's
yeah,
I think a fundamental difference. I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong. Oftentimes in the private sector, I think there is a mutual alignment on the part of the board and the executive to get out and separate as cleanly with as minimal public
right,
scrutiny or
right,
black eyes as possible. In our world, oftentimes there is a political motivation on the part of the elected body or elected officials to make it as ugly and as nasty as
sure,
possible. And I think that's an interesting paradox or dichotomy or whatever the word I'm
yeah,
looking for right now of difference between the public and the private sector. And the reality is that the damage that the public sector executive faces in that environment is much more significant to their career and reputation moving forward than anything that the private sector
yeah.
executive faces. And that's why I say this imbalance.
Yeah, and keep in mind you're not going to be able to cover up in the traditional sense something in a quiet settlement agreement when the settlement agreement is probably going to be a matter of
A
public
public
record,
document. Yeah.
right? Which is very different from the public, excuse me, from the private sector.
Absolutely.
There are a number of tools you can use in the toolbox to potentially mitigate those issues, particularly around indemnification clauses and provisions that call for the municipality to cover legal fees. It would be an aggressive ask, but certainly if an executive was concerned that the relationship could go south or you had a change of control and they tried to toss you out on a for cause termination, assume it will invite a lengthy and expensive legal battle. Not good really for either side, but again, the public sector, city and town councils, they're not playing with their own pocketbook. They may be more tempted to go down that route. Well, if they have to also cover the legal fees of the executive, perhaps up to a cap, perhaps in certain situations, perhaps if there's legal insurance that would kick in, things like that, that could mitigate the risk to the executive. You may have a fight, but at least you're not going to bankrupt yourself having it. Those are the
Right.
types of things you should have. Yes, you should have as concrete as possible a for cause termination. What that means, how that would typically that's not going to trigger any severance in a traditional sense, and you just want that in your contract. You have your without cause termination, which is the really important piece, and then you also have resignation for good reason, which is common in the private sector, but that's when you're keeping your job, they're keeping you right where you are, and they're elevating people above you, and they're changing your job description, and they're pulling responsibilities from you, and they're basically diminishing your position to the point where it's a shell of its former self. You typically have an obligation to put them on notice, put the community on notice that you have to correct this within 30, 60, 90 days. If they don't, you can resign for good reason, and it typically would have the same effect as a without cause termination, and it would carry with it severance and related benefits that would kick in as if they terminated you without cause.
I guess what I'm getting at too is I think that in the public sector, if we as executives have to make a concerted effort to negotiate contracts that essentially incentivize peaceful and amicable separations. And I'm not sure we're doing a good job of that because I think one of the reasons why we have this problem, and kind of get back to what we said at the very beginning, outside of this podcast about, city managers not being the best negotiators and what have you, is that I don't think a lot of city managers are going in with their eyes wide open with the expectation that, hey, this is probably going to go sour at some point and I need to protect myself on the back end. And that's sort of why I kind of even came into being on LinkedIn and this podcast was this idea like, hey, we need to protect ourselves. You and I, we did a pre-interview screening call last week. and I'm not sure how we want to unpack this right now, but I've talked about language in a contract that says, hey, when there's a control change, right, a change in election, a seated officials, when there's an election, that there might be cooling off periods, right? So something like, you can't get fired or separated within 120 days of an election, exactly, for whatever. So they're not incentivized to fire you when they're going out the door, and they're not incentivized to fire you as soon as they take office, right? Because we see all kinds of, in fact, Yukon, Oklahoma, we just had a situation last week where the city manager, been there for 28 years, got fired basically 7 hours after the mayor was officially, became the mayor, I guess, or whatever. What are your thoughts on how we can make these separations more professional and amicable? Because I've said before, and I'll say it again, governing bodies have the right to fire us. There's not a problem there. No one quibbles with that. But we just say, hey, get rid of us the right way. Get rid of us in a professional way. You don't need to drag our name through the mud. You don't need to
Right.
have this negative, press headlines that are going to follow us on future job searches. How do we, as public sector executives, get into an environment where we are creating a greater likelihood of amicable separations?
Well, among other things, a really strong, and by strong I mean probably standard, non-disparagement clause or section of the contract would probably be helpful, binding on all parties, that could be enforced against the city or town or organization if they try to drag the executive through the mud. I think you'll always have the ability, you have to have the ability for the public sector agency to terminate someone. But really, what you have to look at is, what is the long-term value in the eyes of the executive? What's the long-term value of the contract, and what would, if they terminate you at any time, ideally they could walk away with the balance of their contract. If we're like the private sector, not in every contract, but in the ideal private sector contract, you would have something to that effect or equivalent to that. You would want that in the public sector. If I'm hired for a 5-year stint, I know I have 5 years of value. If they get rid of me, they have to pay me, but I know I'm getting my 5 years of value if it's a without cause termination or a good reason resignation. Um, to the other point you mentioned about dragging through the mud and settlement agreements, these things are public. And that is why I would counsel my client and the municipality to be very careful, particularly if we're negotiating an executive session or some sort of closed door meeting, as it probably would be, to hammer out the contours of an agreement. The language is going to be very important. What is public facing in the document? No matter what brought us to this point, particularly if it's not a matter of public record, if someone wasn't arrested, but you just have a bad mix of personalities and a new council is elected or something like that, then you want to be careful about the settlement agreement and agreeing to language that makes it clear you're parting both ways, but you're really not getting into details. And what you're putting in the public record, which will live forever on Google, won't hurt my client going into the future. And again, you're binding the agency, probably not the elected official personally, but at least the organization, to a non-disparagement clause that would keep them from going outside of the scope of the four corners of the document. Um, Confidentiality provisions are always nice to have, but in the context of the public sector, I'm always cautious about telling my client, yeah, they can't talk about this because, let's be honest, they're politicians and they probably will, and they'll leak it and we won't be able to know who it is. So don't bank on that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack here, and we're not going to get it all today. But I've been playing with this idea of the public sector executive contracts becoming more dynamic, I guess. And what I mean by that, Dan, is I feel like, and I don't know how to put this in words, I'm not an attorney, but I feel like most contracts are sort of have this sort of static, um, they're not really flexible, or a way they're not really, I guess, structured or written in such a way as to be adaptive to the evolving landscape or environment a city manager finds themselves in. And I've been playing with this idea of trigger clauses or trigger language in contracts, and I'm not sure exactly how to unpack that here. And I was wondering if I could maybe just kind of throw it out what I mean, right? This idea like that when certain things happen, it triggers certain things in the contract or whatever. And I feel like there's a way to draft contracts that are just much more geared towards protecting the executive and almost being preventative maintenance, so to speak, I guess, because it's like, hey, this is here. And like, does that make sense what I'm saying? I
Yeah,
don't know
yeah.
if you're tracking me at all. Can you?
No, we've already started talking about that in the context of the severance. That's a trigger
Right.
that does hopefully will provide downside protection for the executive in the event of change of control, differences of opinions, they change your job. That should really be a pretty broad downside protection. It's an insurance policy inside the contract for the executive. There's the other side of this, which is trigger provisions in a contract that enhances the compensation if you do certain things that you're supposed to do. This is something rare in public sector contracts. You'll see it in quasi-public contracts, heads of airport authorities and things like that, where they really run more like businesses. But I think this comes back to how you're hired. What's that scorecard? What's your job description? But if you hit certain benchmarks, you could perhaps get something, X plus something. If you just hit the ball out of the park, you could get X times something, things like that. That's really going to be situation dependent. It's also, of course, and I have to leave this caveat because we're talking public sector, it may be restricted by the town or city charter. It
Or
may be
state law.
restricted or
Yeah.
state law. Right. So, there could be those provisions. But again, charters can be changed, not easily, but they can be changed. State law can be changed, particularly if it's a part of a broader movement to overhaul how public sector executives are hired. And that has to be part of the conversation too, where you run up against those restrictions. The law has been changed to allow you to do more. That's going to take time, but should be a part of this process as well. But to your question about the trigger provisions, they can take all sorts of forms, and they can, it really depends on what you're being hired to do. What are the challenges? What are the real opportunities, and what does strong success look like?
I have often thought about the idea of enhancing compensation through greater incentivized metrics or bonus structures, right? Because as I alluded to earlier in this podcast, and I've talked about time and time again, so often those managers who perform exceptionally well, they will get a COLA just like anybody else who is keeping the seat warm, and they might get a couple extra 100 basis points, or maybe a little bonus or a one-time bonus. And I do think that that's something that's sorely missing in the public sector is that compensation or that reward for those executives who are really crushing it and knocking it out of the park. When it comes to other aspects of private sector compensation versus the public sector, in your history of negotiating and representing private sector executives, what else are you seeing out there in the landscape that you think is something that public sector executives might want to be focusing on or exploring, or what are things you see working there that might work in the public sector or should be considered in the public sector? Because
Uh,
the
yeah.
basic thing, for example, like we get is like we get a car allowance, or we get like a cell phone allowance. I've talked about in previous podcasts and posts on LinkedIn that I think in the post-pandemic world where executives are expected to work around the clock, what I mean, like you're always on, right? You're always on the job, so to speak. That there should be greater benefits for home offices and sort of outfitting a home office and that technology and that sort of deal. What are some interesting things that you're seeing in the private sector that you think might be able to have some play in the public sector?
To your last point, post COVID, we've seen a greater enhancement of the benefits offered for employees really at all levels for your home office, for technology. Cell phone is more of a traditional allowance, but now it's outfitting your whole home. They will ship your computer to you, they'll ship a standing desk to your office. They will get you hooked up. They may or may not cover part of your telecommunications expenses, your cable bill, presuming your Wi-Fi is off that, something like that. That could be very helpful. Again, that's certainly in a company where work from home is acceptable or encouraged. And for executives, like you said, there's this idea that presumption that you're kind of always on. So just because we're investing in your home office doesn't mean we don't expect you in the main office. That's just where you work
Right.
when we bother you at midnight, and that's why we give you that benefit. I think there's some things that aren't going to be seen in your yearly contract that are important from the very beginning. Better use of relocation allowances in this market we're in right now, particularly with home mortgage rates being so much higher than where they were just a few years ago. It's going to be very difficult to incentivize an employee or a manager or an executive to leave a market that requires a physical relocation when their mortgage is going to go from 3% to 8%.
Right.
So that really will, unless you're going to recruit only within your market, which may be possible, but that's also really limiting the size of the pond you're going to be fishing from. I think the municipality, the organization should be prepared to offer much more substantial relocation assistance. Maybe it's through some sort of grossed up sign on bonus.
What
Maybe
is that?
it's the
What is a grossed up sign on bonus? What does that mean in car?
Well, so you have a sign-on bonus. I use the term gross up because let's say an employee or employer, excuse me, starts with a sign-on bonus, and it's always kind of this random number. We have your salary, we have your bonus. Maybe I'm talking private sector. Maybe some long-term incentives. And then there's always this sign-on bonus. And the question always is like, it's great. I certainly want the money for my client. I don't know exactly why we're getting this. It's basically the incentive to take the job, is what they'll
Right.
tell you. So I use that. My
And
clients,
sign-on
usually
bonuses aren't very
recruiters,
common in public sector at all.
right? And how we use that in the private sector, and this isn't me. This is recruiters. Is a huge tool for recruiters and search firms in the private sector and executives themselves. Is we gross up the sign-on bonus to cover additional relocation expenses, moving expenses. Visits to the. We'll probably cover the visits separately, but visits to the market a few times to look at houses, look at schools for their kids, things like that. Perhaps down payment for a new house. In this market, you probably would have to go that direction of maybe not buying a house, but some sort of rate buy down or some sort of substantial down payment assistance to really allow that relocation to happen. The vehicle I would use for something like that would be your sign-on bonus. You should get one, and it should kind of cover all of these things, plus be that added benefit to signing on the dotted line. It's not tied to performance. You get it when you sign, and oftentimes you have to repay it if you leave within 90 days or 6 months or a year or something like that. It does work both ways, but I think that's a great tool that should be used more often in the
If
public sector.
if we're talking about my attempt or my desire to reduce the volatility in the profession, right? Doesn't Wouldn't it logically dictate then that the more aggressive we can be as professionals, public sector executives, in front loading benefits and aspects of our contract, front loading it, doesn't that in a sense stave off or minimize the volatility as opposed to just having it amortized, so to speak, across the life of the contract? For example, you talk about like down payment assistance, but even like a car allowance, for example, right? Like, what if you were to say, hey, I'm going to sign on for a 3-year contract and I want my 3-year car allowance up front, for example. And that way, when you fire me, then the city, if you fire me without cause, the city loses that car allowance, whatever.
As long as it can't be clawed back is the important thing.
Well, assuming,
Yeah,
well, yeah, well,
definitely.
unless if you got fired for cause, obviously it could be clawed back. But my expectation would be if you got fired without cause, it couldn't be clawed back, and if you resigned voluntarily, you get clawed
Sure.
back,
Yeah,
obviously.
right.
But
Ideally, yeah.
I guess my thought process is there ways to start maybe looking at executive compensation in ways that we can maybe front load things and maybe make that sort of more of a bigger sort of, I don't want to say a poison pill, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But
Well, I don't know if looking at it in the context of another trigger is the best way to look at it. First and foremost, you're not going to be able to have the model which you see in the private sector, which is, especially for executives, the vast majority of their compensation is going to be on the back end of the
right,
deal.
with stock options or something, right?
Because that's
Yeah,
where they're creating the value. You're not going
right.
to have that in the private sector. So to some extent, you are going to have to front load that compensation in order to incentivize them to move. You're not These aren't people who are going necessarily be motivated by the back end. They're not used to it, and there's nothing to give them there. So there is something to be said for the for putting it on the front end. But I think if you build in enough protections elsewhere in the contract, you don't have to worry so much about, oh, they paid my car allowance up front, so now they're not going to fire me. I mean, I think most city and town councils will probably make the decision in the moment, right? As opposed to, oh yeah, we paid you X amount so far, it's a waste. They'll be more incentivized to not make a rash decision if they know it's going to come with a check that has to be written to you at the time of termination, because that's something that they have to take back to their constituents and justify.
Right. What are your thoughts on private sector leave and vacation and sick time, and how does that normally work, and payouts and stuff? Because in the public sector, generally speaking, it's all over the map when it comes to city managers, especially depending on the size of the jurisdiction. It's not uncommon for a city manager in a decent sized organization to get 4 to 5. Even I've seen 6 weeks of vacation a year. Sometimes they have open-ended balances they can accrue. Sometimes they're capped, and it's a use or lose type situation.
Yeah.
Private sector contracts. What are your thoughts on that? Because, for example, states like New Jersey, Illinois, and Florida, they both have like a 20-week severance cap. I think New Jersey has a 12-week severance cap. other ways to try to like sort of manufacture or create a severance buffer? And obviously, if you have acquired a decent amount of leave, if you're front loading some leave on the contract initiation, you can kind of create or manufacture some additional months of severance. In my mind, as what your thoughts are on that.
It's certainly an added tool, particularly if you're in a jurisdiction that does limit severance. Rhode Island is one of those jurisdictions for state and quasi-public agencies, limited to no more than 1 year. That's another way you can get additional time to be paid out. Normally, though, there is some sort of limitation on the amount of vacation pay that can be accrued and then paid out upon termination. That's also governed by state law. So you're dealing typically with two areas that you don't have a lot of wiggle room. You want to maximize it, but I can't say it's a huge point of negotiation, especially at the executive level, where there's this, maybe on paper, this is a timesheet employee, but in reality, you're always on, you're always doing
Right.
something. You may be able to play with comp time, again, depending on the jurisdiction to even it all out. But these are jobs that have people always on, generally speaking. So it's important that you have that in the contract, obviously, to take the family to Disney World. You can't be seen as being out of the office and abandoning your post. No, you clearly have a legal right to take time off, even if you're still, the phone's still going to ring. But
Right.
it's not always a major point of negotiation. In the private sector now, it increasingly is unlimited PTO, which in reality means people take less of it than they did before. It's a tool used by companies to encourage you, but when you can take as much as you want, you end up taking less than when you had your guaranteed 2 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever that was. So
Especially at the end of the day, you can take as much PTO as you want, but at the end of the day, if you're not performing, you're going to get fired anyway. So people are
exactly,
going, I'm just going to stay in the office and work, right? I mean, that's the
exactly.
American way.
Exactly. And you can't necessarily, I don't know the way you'd be able to translate that to the public sector, where, especially when the vast majority of employees are subject to collective bargaining agreements, you're not going to go giving unlimited PTO. So when the executive contract mirrors the vacation policy for the jurisdiction, you're probably going to be again, it's case by case, but you may be reverting to what the language the municipalities already agreed to on that subject is.
Two things. One, you mentioned a second ago about the state of Rhode Island having limits on quasi and state officials and quasi municipal or something like that. But I think in
Yep.
our pre-screen interview, or after our pre-screen interview, you did some research, and it was your understanding, I think, that in Rhode Island municipalities that you don't think there actually is a cap on severance, correct?
Yeah, so municipalities are a separate creature. Generally speaking, they're not a politically created. They're chartered by their constituents. So we can set state law that applies to all of them equally, and we can certainly you could restrict their severance, technically speaking, through state law. It wouldn't be precluded, but the way the law reads now, it does not directly apply to them. It's interesting because in practice, in Rhode Island, so this is kind of a very narrow discussion here, but it's interesting because the restriction does apply to quasi-public executives, and the quasi-public executives are typically going to be the highest paid employees in the state. Except in Rhode Island, our highest paid is the basketball coach at URI, which you can imagine why. But a lot of the
That's a
state
separate podcast all on
that's
its own.
a separate podcast. I don't knock them for getting paid. I think other executives should get paid more. When you're running a Medicaid agency with a $4 billion budget, you shouldn't be making 10% of a basketball coach. But that's a different podcast. But so it's interesting because those are the quasi public agencies where you will see more private sector like contracts. Yet they still have this restriction. And what you tend to see when you have terminations of executives in those organizations are settlements that are released because they have to be, and they're being terminated because probably you have a new CEO of the agency or something. They're cleaning house at the VP level, bringing in their own people. And then the severance packages are negotiated with the board, and a number is released. Well, what is the number? Well, it's their vacation day, and it's an amount. It's never a severance payment, right? It's a vacation days, and it's always tied to something else, so that you're
Right.
not being seen as offering severance greater than 1 year of
Right.
pay.
Right.
If you have someone who's getting paid a lot of money. But generally speaking, I don't think that's a best practice. I think we should remove that from state law. What it will do if you're
You
negotiating a
think what should
con,
be removed? You think the cap should be removed on
yeah,
severance?
the cap on severance, because
So you support the idea that if a city manager I want to make sure I understand this correctly. You support the idea that if a public sector executive enters into a multi-year contract, that they should be paid out the entire contract if they're terminated before the expiration of that contract. Is that what you're saying,
Well,
or am I misunderstanding you?
no, yeah, conceivably, if that's what you've worked in the contract, that should be achievable. It shouldn't be barred by state law, and the reason for that is one, if you have something like that, if you're able to pay out automatic severance to an executive, you're going to be able to recruit people who know they have that safety valve. It's not about guaranteeing the comp. They still have to have the job. If they just decide to up and quit, they don't get that. It's
Right.
to protect them against the termination. You're going to encourage people to want to have that job more if you can build that into a contract. But if you're precluded by law from including that in the contract, you're left having to negotiate the other points. So now your immediate cash compensation this year perhaps becomes more important because it's not guaranteed money.
Right.
And when you can't guarantee the money, it changes who you're going to talk to about the job in the first place. And then it's going to
Absolutely.
change what the compensation picture looks like. I don't think it puts the state in a competitive position. I can imagine the counter argument to this and why there's probably some
Well, and you're a
situation.
former elected official, so you get the optics of every that this is the
It,
classic thing, and this could be its own standalone podcast, right? You have these public sector college coaches and whatnot; they'll get a multi-year deal, and they can basically walk off into the sunset with 5 years remaining on the contract if they get fired, right? And
right.
then if you're a public sector executive, as far as a city manager or whatnot, you're just stuck to 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months, or generally whatever that is. But that kind of gets back to the heart of what I've been kind of like beating the drum on over the last 18 months is like, there's there's got to be more skin in the game
Yeah.
to decrease the volatility.
On
And
both
also,
sides.
yeah, exactly. And if you and logic would dictate that if your severance compensation is artificially lower through a cap, right, like it is in Florida or Illinois or New Jersey, then correspondingly executive compensation should go up on an annual basis to offset that
Right.
artificial cap. I mean,
Correct. All things being equal, right? The cap on your insurance policy is going to mean your short-term risk is greater and you're going to have to be compensated for that risk. I think in practice, how it plays out is you're going to disincentivize certain people from even applying for the job
oh,
or even
absolutely.
looking to it, right?
Yeah, yeah, right.
Because the best people are are not going to be. They want that insurance policy because they know they're good for the 5 years. They want the 5 years. They want to probably get a renewal at the end of 5 years, but on even better terms. But this is just to keep people from meddling in their day to day and keeping them from doing their jobs. And if
Right.
they don't have that in there, the question is, how do you account for that risk and who do you attract? It's very difficult because now you're at the whim of who's ever hiring you. You're at the whim potentially of the next election. And I get it. Again, back to the counter argument. I'm sure there were cases, and this is not a recent law, where you had someone walk away with a huge check, and that created a political firestorm
Firestorm. Yep.
and led to an outright restriction. Nope, can't do it ever. When in reality, what it should mean is it should trigger a reflection on the public sector cutting that check, the elected officials cutting that check because they failed.
Right.
Not that the executive is walking away with the money. There's accountability on both sides. Again, they can't up and leave. They can't break the law. I mean, they don't have free license to do anything they want. But provided they do their job, they have guaranteed money and a guaranteed job. We certainly apply that in the collective bargaining realm. We have to, in the context of public employees. So we're not suggesting doing it any other way. For executives, you certainly have to have the right to terminate them, but you have to have these safety valve provisions in their contracts so you attract the right people who understand that they're not guaranteed to be in the office tomorrow. But if something is done casually or without justification, that they're going to get paid for it.
Well, and that's the thing too. Elected officials, if they're listening to this podcast, they need to understand that the most talented individuals out there who you want to basically lead your city, right? If you're a multi-billion-dollar municipal corporation, right? A lot of cities out there got a billion plus budgets, right? Definitely in the multiple hundreds of millions. If you want somebody who's talented, who's exceptional to lead your organization, they don't need to take on elevated levels of risk just to go work for you. You're recruiting them. You got to make it sexy and enticing for them to come
Exactly.
work for you. They're sitting over there in their seat, happy as a clam. They're
Right.
safe. They got a great relationship with the current governing body. They're making a decent living. Why do they want to take on that risk to go work for you and start
Right.
from scratch?
Right. Or
You got to
there's
make it worth
someone
their
who's
while.
just right. And if they're not responding to those incentives, that means that they're just looking for the job. And that's
Right.
probably an indicator they're not the type of talent you're looking for.
Here's the reality: the lower quality the manager, as far as skills and ability, the more risk they're going to be willing to assume to get the job.
Right.
That's just. I mean, there's a
100%.
corollary to that. So, we're getting a little long on this podcast. I could talk to you for another couple hours, Dan. But before we go and wrap up, I'd like to give you an opportunity to maybe beat the drum on the recruitment process in terms of spousal family support, visiting job sites and communities and what have you. And can you just give us a rundown? Because right now it's not uncommon. I hear horror stories oftentimes about city manager candidates that's not getting any reimbursement, period,
Mm.
which is shocking to me. So that still happens. But then there's so many communities will only pay for the city manager candidate him or herself to go, but they won't actually compensate or pay for the spouse to go. What do you see in the private sector, and what do you think we can do better in the public sector on that front?
Well, if you're covering those types of expenses in the private sector, you'd be extremely stubborn to not include the spouse. The spouse has a vote. The spouse, in all likelihood, has veto power over this decision. And if you don't incorporate them into the process early on with the candidate and understand that the candidate may be really excited talking to you about the opportunity, but they also have to go home and talk to their spouse, you're not going to win them over. I've seen many people who loved an opportunity, it was great for them, but it just couldn't work for family reasons. And that's not because the spouse was being difficult. The children are in school, they've gotten settled in the community, all for all great, understandable reasons. It just wouldn't work out, not because the candidate didn't like the job. So in terms of recruiting, you have to include them. A recruiter who doesn't incorporate that into the process early on is going to be surprised, and not in a good way, when the employee or the candidate has to pull out, and probably in front of the client, probably towards the end, and no one looks good when that happens. For the public sector to adapt, this doesn't require a radical sea change in the recruiting process, especially if you're trying to recruit someone from outside of the market. You're going to have to make sure the spouse is comfortable. You're going to have to, if there's a spouse involved, if there's a family involved, you have to understand their stakeholders in this, and they're going to have to be comfortable in taking the deal along with the candidate themselves.
What kind of frequency of visits, number of visits are you seeing? Are families bringing the spouse on, say, trip one, and then they bring the kids on the second trip, if at all? I mean, I'm sure it's going to vary based off the each
Yeah,
recruitment, but I mean, I assume the corporation that is recruiting this executive is going to pay for the spouse and the kids to come out. Are they actually? And we're getting maybe into the weeds, but maybe not. Something I've kind of wondered is, why aren't cities doing more to sort of roll out the red carpet for the
yeah,
spouse and family, right? Do you
yeah.
see private sector corporations maybe putting together some sort of program so that, like, when the executive candidate's being, doing a site visit with the board or other department heads and VPs, is the spouse and the kids going off and doing a tour of the city of something else? Or can you walk me through that? How's that work?
It really is situation dependent. I've heard from recruiters who are a lot better at recruiting than I was in the short time I did it, of some really, great stories of how they won over candidates to some parts of the country that were very difficult to recruit from, for business units that say were out in the middle of the Midwest and you're trying to get someone out of New York City or vice versa, something like that. And you're, depending on the arrangement, maybe the recruiter was covering the cost of travel to get the person out to do an in-person interview, probably was going to be billed back to the client. But then on top of that, the client agreed to cover, one, typically two, maybe more visits, to come out with the spouse, maybe the kids, look at a house, look at schools. It's a process. I mean, this could be a multi-month process. It doesn't happen right away,
Right.
but they have to get comfortable. They have to know that it's going to work for them. And you see the recruiter or someone from the company picking them up from the airport directly. They're maybe literally or figuratively wining and dining them to get in, right? Not all of these things are going to be analogous to the public sector.
Sure.
But you can imagine this is what it takes to get top talent.
You're competing, right? I
You're going
mean,
to have to do something. Certainly putting on your best face, showing them the community, particularly if you're going to require that they live there, or maybe if the down payment assistance or some relocation assistance would suggest that they're going to move there or in the area, they're going to have to get familiar with it. They're going to have to at least get to like it. And then certainly you can imagine they're going to be in government. They serve everywhere. You may have to bring them to a remote location. You may have to bring them someplace, and it's going to be really difficult to make that sale. But that's why the recruiter gets paid the fee. That's also probably why the executive's going to get paid more to take that opportunity.
Yeah, I think sometimes you see a lot of governing bodies just sort of look at the candidate only and don't consider the entire package that the candidate is has to consider when they are looking at taking that job. When they're looking at taking that job.
Right.
Hey, I could talk to you for another 2 hours on the subject, and I would like to have you on again at a later date, Dan. We're going to wrap it up here. I really thank you for being on the podcast. It's been a great discussion. Before we go, is there anything I can plug for you, or you want?
If anyone has any questions, I'm always open to a conversation if I can be of any help in any way. My email is the best way to reach me, dan@reillylegalgroup.com, and my website is reillylegalgroup.com. Feel free to drop me a message, and I'd love to connect.
Awesome. I'll put your website in the show notes, and then they can find you there. Thank you very much, Dan. It's been a pleasure. I am Joe Turner. This is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and other public sector executives. It is the most influential local government podcast in America. If you enjoyed the content, if you like what I'm putting out there, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. Please take a moment to leave a rating and review, especially if you're on Apple or Spotify. And no one else is doing this. No one else is putting this kind of content out there. I hope you enjoyed it, and catch you next time. Thank you very much.